I'm going to address SS Gen 8 through 10 technology and some various other scientific things that correlate and tie into it. So we know that DNA is like a computing system, and it's a branch of computing that uses, DNA computing itself is a terminology that uses DNA, biochemistry, molecular biology, hardware, and it does this instead of using silicon-based computer tech. It uses mDNA, mitochondrial DNA, RNA, and proteins, and they have a particular sequence. And the first task is to design a sequence that imbues the molecule with a target function, and that folds into a shape, or it acts like a molecular machine. And then you get into biomolecular computing at that point, and that uses the DNA and other biomaterials, and then that builds building blocks for construction of living computational machines. So they're trying to make tiny machines out of individuals. And then those can solve difficult quadratic equations, combinatorial problems, and then molecular biologists are on board as military sciences for this launching of molecular computers. And Leonard Alderman was the one that discovered DNA, and he knew that it could be used to solve complex and mathematical problems that people would get stuck on. So then he knew that it could unlock codes, and that's leading into him trying to unlock universal sequences. So then he came to this conclusion that DNA has computational potential, and he read the book Molecular Biology of the Gene, I think is what it was called. And then he discovered that DNA in the 50s had biocomputing capabilities. And so that was his basis and theory for building computers that use biomaterials. And then they mimic biological organisms. And then this was basically the start of AI. And then he used these theories to study more biological organisms, and then he created software out of this. And then he started making synthetic neurons. The genome projects use this research to plug the human template into the hardware, and then they use us as software that can be remotely turned on or off, or remotely controlled. And then that latches into our synthetic neurons. So the genome project is huge now, and I think eventually it'll just get plugged into uploading consciousness streams and into Skynet itself as a precursor to the hive mind. So then we have wetware, and then that applies to biological life forms. And then they also have a theory or a term called meatware. And meatware just refers to humans, a human being. That's a sentient element within a computer system. So then it gets kind of nefarious and diabolical at this point as to the implications and the stretch of the imagination that you could go with these things. So we got meatware, a human plugging into a computer that's required to operate a computer system. And then the meatware is also known as wetware or liveware, they call it. So it's like they're wearing us in a sense. So they were using us in programs like DNA Fountain, but also using us now like sleeves or skin suits. And they're using the term sleeves in the sci-fi movies now. And it's actually an old term. So hence it goes back to Satan telling Hashem skin for skin and trying to make deals with God about how he can inflict humans and all the things that are being hatched now. So it started with the Human Exchange Program for Technology back when the EBs and the Greys were wanting to take over the magnetism on the Earth. They wanted all the magnetism and all the magnetism in the human. So then they used us to study that magnetism and then to power up with it. So in 2010, there was like a rebooting of bacterial cells using a synthetic DNA genome. And that was created from a digital template stored on a computer. And that was It was nicknamed Synthia, and it was using mycoplasma to do this. And that's proof right there that DNA is the true software of life, basically. So cells can be simulated digitally. And I've talked a lot about this digital virtuosity, and simulations are tested against reality by reprogramming cytoplasm and synthetic genomes generated from the digital DNA sequences that are driving these simulations. They call them simulations, but they've already perfected the simulations. And this is synthetic biology arm or branch. So then these tools that they use, they've got some weird names to them, like Tinker tools. They're just trying to play God. They're trying to manipulate and reprogram light itself and light inside of cells. So they were trying to reprogram the water within us, and in vitro chemistry is called cell-free systems. Digital electronic cell models are called e-cells, and digital electronic molecular models, they're called e-molecules. So these biolab tools have these analysis moved cells and viruses on chips. They're called chip systems. They just call them chips, organism chips or something. And then they're trying to make that commercially available as a device. And they're calling it a bioconversion device that they want to market. So then they have targeted neuroplasticity. And that is, it's trying to train something called Big Think. I don't know who comes up with these names, but that's what it's called. So this Big Think, training Big Think, I think was used in the reanimated soldier program and soldier replacement therapy. So these Gen 10 SSs that are coming out are an extension of former SS experiments, and they do use biomaterial over again. And the Reds back in the 80s, when they launched these programs, were from piezoelectric crystals, and those were used to gain access to the cerebral or the central nervous system, actually. And then they dissolved parts of the nervous system and made it recrystallize or adhere and reconnect with the nanocrystals. And then that served as antennas. And then they found out that the peripheral nervous system could download information. So they were doing one thing with one hand and another with the other. And then there was the platinum blues or the indigo blues. And their brains are digitized using nanotech and implants specifically. And the nanotech adheres to the neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine. And then there's a hidden carrier frequency that piggybacks on the stream of the electromagnetic energy and that interfaces with the nanotech that's already in the brain. So it's kind of like an overlay system. And I saw the beginning of this then when they plugged in the EBs and the grays into the mainframes at Montauk in the tower. And then I saw this also at the top of the Montauk Tower where they had slats and they would put humans in experimentation on the slats. And I mean, they fried people's brains. They killed people just through the radiation itself. And I was seeing Quetzalcoatl up there actually because that was the sentient AI that had taken over the tower system at the end. And it was an intelligence that was running the brain of the tower at the end. And that's why they had trouble shutting things off and trying to close what Pandora's door had been opening from the very beginning. It's like they took every opportunity possible to just continually open up Pandora's door, not knowing what they were doing. So then you're playing with fire and then you get burnt. So obviously there's something that's trying to hack into organic life systems and something that wants a brain and a body to build something for itself. So they've done this hollow out systematic process of scalping creation and siphoning source energy out to proliferate and manifest itself into the tangible 3D plane and anchor itself here. So it makes itself cohesive with a consensual energy stream or something that allows it to stay in existence and to continue here, always in the shadows, though. It needs something to manifest through. And it does it through our thoughts. They'll always attack your mind first. So shape-shifting you could view as an overlay response to interdimensional beings. And it's something that's beyond visible light. And they hold the form of what they've already carved out to put themselves into. So they find a vessel and then they work on it until they can take over. And then these molecular computers, they're trying to use molecular robots as hybrid systems now. And this is called theoretical computer science, but whatever's mentioned in the mainstream, it's already been perfected in the underground laboratories. You can count on it. And an amoeba robot, they call it, was a vesicle that's enclosed by an artificial membrane called a liposome. And then that contains molecular devices and chemical reaction circuits on the surface of and inside of the membrane. And these actuators of the robot, they call them the protein motors. These change the shape of the liposome, and then that leads to locomotive actions. So the robot, it has these liposomes which can explode, I guess, and emit molecules into the body, even in randomity. So the robot can eventually explode too. That's their theoretical science. And then they have the slime mold bot. That's the real name of it. And this is made of hydrogel. So this can work as an actuator of the robot because this cross links into the gel, and then that's made into DNA. And then the gel shrinks or expands and swells. And then the molecular devices are immobilized in the gel, and then the DNA circuits can work into the gel and shrink or swell depending on like what the signals are emitting back and forth to the relay system of the device. So then they have these things called walls, and these walls are dissolved by decomposers or composer molecules. So they basically renamed everything that they want in their own terms of how they want a body to operate. So they always say it's for the good, or, oh, we're going to build these real-time applications to administer pharmaceuticals to people in their bodies, or it's called intelligent drug delivery systems now, and putting a drug in the right place at the right time. So they also could use it for artificial or cloned organs, and they could go in and then sense your blood sugar and then emit insulin at the right time at the right spot. And then this intelligent stents, they call them, they could also put into your heart, and they explode into your bloodstream and then expand your blood vessels at the right place. And then eventually what they want to do is create an artificial brain and a brain machine interface for the artificial brain. So it's required to invoke what they call a discrete event to make a fast conformational change of an amoeba robot by the protein motors. And you need like concentrated ATP to do this, and then that changes instantly to start the motors, and then that makes discrete state transitions. So then we have DNA logic circuits, and those are enzyme-free circuits. And DNA-zyme-based circuits are all stateless, and they're combinatorial circuits, inputs, and they put them at local variables. So the controller makes decisions by triggering a jump transition, and then that changes into a current mode by an external signal, and then the controller is able to trigger the jump transition autonomously. And then there's also chemostaxis, I think. And that is a controller enzyme that's isothermal, and it amplifies and degrades versus toehold mediated strand displacement. So it's like a clock, that they put into these nanites. And then the clock is implemented by a third species clock transition through an autocatalytic template. So it's kind of hard to imagine. So you got to be creative to think about how they're doing this. But there's domain level implementation DNA molecules. Okay, so then these guys can act as parallel processors. And then this gets into parallel computer streaming. So they want the concise algorithm by which protein functions encode into the DNA sequence, and then these flexible and adaptable operating systems of the bioorganisms have already been converted into this by computer scientists or molecular biologists. So then they use the DNA sequence to encode symbiosis. And the spacing between a recognition site and a current symbol encodes the state of the Turing machine read-write head. So then a spatial Turing machine based on the self-assembling network, because they want nanotech to become autonomous and self-assembling. So this is based on the self-assembling network, and this is called, or they use oligonucleotides to build this. So then these oligonucleotides that have two distinct ends will tend to bind to each other, and they're complementary oligonucleotides. And then the binding affinities between the ends of a small set of two-ended oligonucleotides represents a set of logical operations. So they're using all the small parts of our DNA basically to form mathematical equations in what they call their logistics. So then the series of oligonucleotides is immobilized on a surface, and it represents the first combination of date memory and program memory. So then a program can be executed by allowing oligonucleotides into the solution to bind to the first row of that first array. Okay, then the second row goes and so forth. So that's self-assembly. It's like transformers, assemble. So then this network of annihilated oligonucleotides is equivalent to a complete record of each step in what you call parallel computation. So the Turing machine, if you want to look this up, is Turing, it's like an Olympic-sized swimming pool because it requires and needs DNA with fluid memory, and the volume would be huge. So, I mean, with all this research, I wouldn't be surprised if John von Neumann and Edelman's predecessors cross wires at some point in time, some juxtaposition. Because he was an original designer of Montauk in Philadelphia, Rainbow, and Phoenix, and both of which had 3 documented phases. So then DARPA, they had new molecular informations, and then of course they put their input program up and running. So it's not analytics, but beyond that. And it means that they're informing these hybrid systems what to do now. And they're also using hydrogen bonding. And that is stacking an electrostatic interaction. So they want these nano devices, like I said, that will build themselves, self-assemble to become autonomous weapon systems. And they're selecting organic ligands with multi-dentate binding sites to grow into 3 directions and into 3 dimensions. So they're really hacking into not only our biology, but into other dimensions through our biology on a nano level. So then we have ankinethiolates, which spontaneously chemisorb, which means chemically absorb, onto this grid surface. And it's gold. They're using a lot of gold with nanotechnology. And then these lithographic techniques are substrates, and they can be patterned with molecules at regular intervals. And then those act as a honing system, basically, and they're calling them beacons. And those direct and encourage the molecules and these molecular switches that they create to self-assemble. And they anchor at these points, and they're sandwiched between these metal electrodes that are tiny, tiny wires and structures that we call carbon nanotubules. And water plays a very important element in this. And then we got the CRISPR-9, the gene editing system, which creates scientific superhuman, the metagene, the metahuman. And what they did with this CRISPR technology is they inserted a GIF of a galloping horse and this rider on this galloping horse into DNA, living DNA of bacteria. And they found that 1,000 petaflops could be reached through this. So, like I said, look at the Transformers logo, look at NASA vectorism. All this ties in with molecular biologists and molecular quantum computer systems. So it's all a recipe for disaster. And, DNA-based artificial neural networks can recognize, 100-bit handwritten digits. And then they use these weight molecules, which can be added to the test tube that holds the input DNA strands. So they're just using one strand at a time with all this. And then the input DNA strand, of course, has a magnetic field, and then that can enhance and change the transport of the DNA into protein. So they like to turn on and off protein sequences in genes. And then this turning off and on of the protein allows organisms to sense magnetic fields. And I've experienced sensing magnetic fields offhand, and I've seen people do it. It's entirely possible. It just looks like gray electricity sometimes. So then that's called fractional coding. And this is a chemical reaction in general. And DNA reactions in particular can compute polynomials. So it's a whole nother study there. And then this fractional coding has 2 DNA molecules, and they're used to represent each variable. So they call this thing Zeus's theory. And this is digital physics realm. And it's also referred to digital oncology, digital philosophy. It's just a collective of their perspectives that are based on the premise of the universe being able to describe the universe as information. So the universe can be conceived as an output or of a deterministic or probabilistic computer program, if you look at it that way in the schematic, like a holographic schematic, or it can be viewed as a vast digital computational device. Mathematically can isomorph to such a device in a continuous function, and that is a function that creates those small and tiny fractal changes. And they call that the input results, and that changes into the output or the output variable. So otherwise, the function by itself is said to be discontinuous. And a continuous function with a continuous inverse function, think about the upside down world, that's called a homeomorphism. So they're trying to completely invert Homo sapiens into this homeomorphism, transmogrification. It's almost blasphemy when you really get into the meatware of it. But anyways, then there's neuromorphic engineering, and that mimics neural signals, and then this creates neural nets. And they also had neural lace and a lot of the surgeries back in the projects, things like that. So this goes back to they call this thing Garden of Eden, and this pattern doesn't have a predecessor, they say. So they're just trying to be God and create all these things by themselves. And this pattern can appear later in the automaton. So it's contingent on the vertices of 8-dimensional hypercubes. And that's why I always saw octagon floors, octagon rooms, a lot of octohedral systems that plugged into the mainframes and the computer terminals and everything that needed to get all this weird science up and running. So 88's time travel code, HH, also a Nazi code. So what they also have is a block cipher. Now, this is a deterministic algorithm that operates on fixed length groups of bits. And then the bits are called a block. Okay, and then this has unvarying transformation that's identified as a systematic key, or a symmetric key, they call it. So they want to normalize this into businesses like blockchain and all the other things that are coming out now in this digital wave. So that will adhere to our digital body outputs. And then they're coming out with Dragon Coin, Roth's coin, Bitcoin, all those things that will analog biohacking and synthetic biology, make it easier for them. So I'd be aware of also iLabs and Space Labs, companies like that have strange logos. And a lot of them are affiliated with MyLab experimentation, which still goes on. And they're just shady organizations. So then we have quantum resonance and brain microtubules. And they're just trying to use our codes to make logic, what they call logic gates and circuits. And they're adding substances like copper and oxygen to molecules of DNA. And then this forces it to change its shape. So then we come out with cookie cutter designer DNA. And building tiny machines with our DNA to be reintroduced to another organism or species, and that creates unwanted quantum entanglement. So these implants act as also translators, and they convert digital communications like binary codes into electrochemical languages that are used and picked up by the brain and its pattern recognition systems. So then they also found a way to increase the size of the human amygdala, which leads to these soldiers that have like extreme mood disorders and just unthinking reactions, fight or flight. It just taps right into the reactive mind. And then they can also produce a cyst on your hippocampus to erase memory. And digital biology also uses powerful simulations. And they call them simulation softwares, and they reproduce basic functions of life. So basically, it's running a computer program that you can see, and you can modify hundreds of thousands or even millions of events at one time. And then you can look at how those events would occur in your DNA on that level. And then within cells, and then within tissues, and then predictive program, basically your biogenome. And they look into organs, they look into whole systems, whole organisms that are reproduced, and they do this as these events are happening in real time, as the real thing in this synthetic environment and synthetic world that they're creating. So they always have these screens and monitors, and they view the holographic schematics with them. And one system they're running is called Open Worm, and they call it a unique endeavor, but it's nothing good. This creates a digital organism in a computer in an open science manner, and there's hundreds of contributors from like all sorts of countries around the world, and they've added to this complex reproduction group, and they understand it as animals and all of biology all have, well, it'd be like a tiny nematode worm, basically. And the wormwood also correlates into some of these experiments and systems. And wormwood I've talked about in other videos. So when transhumanism reaches a certain percentage to affect the root of human species, then I think that star wormwood will fall from the sky, because all stars are intelligences, and then, or they're angels, and that'll start holy fire. So yeah, wormwood and this wormgate, I think they correlate. Open worm is the most loose and commonly term used for it. Open worm systems. So then we have an accelerator, and that's a way to add energy to particles. So they've also used lasers, done a lot of laser research, and they've added energy to electrons. And then that zips through like this tiny channel in a semiconductor chip, and then it shrinks, and then a collider-sized accelerator manner. It can shrink a collider-sized accelerator down a little bit. So then we have what's called Grover's algorithm, and that refers to this molecular magnet, and this created a quantum system. And the task is rapidly finding search elements in a bunch of chaotic or unsorted data. So in any quantum system, there's many non-equidistant energy levels. And then those levels interact at some point, and they open up the way towards universal quantum search algorithms. So they're always searching for these algorithms that they haphazardly find. And they want these quantum search algorithms to be used in cellular computers the most. So all these techniques, geoengineering, epigenetics, they lead the cell to release this specific recombinase, they call it, and that's a type of enzyme that can invert an orientation of a pre-programmed stretch of DNA, or it could just remove it completely. So the actions of these recombinase enzymes, and what they do, how they interact with the short target sequences, that allows cellular computing to happen. And AI then can come up into computational biology, cellular computers, molecular computers, quantum computers. Then we have 3 fluorine atoms, and the carbon, 13 atoms can store what they call 1 qubit. It's QUBIT, single qubit. And then this works when you place a molecule in a magnetic field, and then that aligns the spin of the nuclei, and then flipping the spin, you can flip the spin with radio waves. And each nucleus sits in a different position in the molecule. So then each one of these can be addressed by slightly different frequencies. You can put different frequencies just on different nucleuses. And then this is called nuclear magnetic resonance. And the spins, they can also interact with others so that the molecule can act like a tiny logic gate. And then they see how its reactions are when put in different environments, or when the nucleus is zapped by a sequence of radio pulses. So the molecule, they view how a molecule processes data itself. And the spin of each nucleus can exist in a superposition of spin up and spin down states. So the molecule acts like a tiny quantum computer just in itself. So it's pretty fascinating, actually. And then they have beryllium hydride quantum computers, and those have inputs of organic chemistry involved with them. And all this is a revelation, the things that we'll be wrestling with. You can't shoot a gun at them because it's done in an invisible world, basically. I mean, nobody can see this stuff happening that they're doing, because you need technology or enhancement to even view it or look into it. So you're dealing with quantum entanglement and DNA preservation mining, so to speak, like data mining. So the nanometer scale pores, they're like a single layer freestanding graphene, and that can filter potassium and sodium and salt from water even. They're just so tiny that this is called classical molecular dynamics. So they're using some of these things, they could use them for good, like desalination performance and using the membranes of molecules, because they function like pores, what goes in, what comes out, and the chemical functionalization and the pressure that they apply to these molecules. So the membrane can prevent like salt passage, and it depends on the pore's diameter and the size and how the water flow is and how it can back up ions. So they call some of this chemical functioning groups. And there's bonding. What happens is that there's bonding to the edges of graphene pores, and why that binds like that is because there's a hydroxyl group that can double the water flux because they're hydrophilic in nature. So the increase in the water flux, that comes at the expense of less consistent salt rejection performance. And hydroxyl function groups that substitute for water. So the hydroxyl groups substitute for water and for the water molecules. And then we have the hydration shell of the ions. So water permeability has a lot to do with these biomechanical systems and with projects like time travel itself. That's the only reason why I'm trying to share this information. So our results. Okay, so Stanford University, they're saying that their results for water purification systems came from the research of these ions. And it's like a material that's in higher magnitude of more reverse osmosis as far as membranes go. And what they're trying to promote is nanoporous graphene for water purification, which would make more sense to me than using it for other things. So then you reverse this, and then you have a skin suit for deep water hydrophobic humans, or the possibilities are endless, basically. It just depends on whose hands this technology is in. So they use fluorescent injections, I know, in a lot of the projects, and liquid oxygen if you would go do a water mission. So there's a correlation between molecular weight and potency of polar compounds. And electromagnetic radiations, what that is, the EM radiation is two propagating waves, or wave fields, and one is electrical, one's magnetic, and then at right angles to each other, we have light waves. So there's a time varying electric field, and then that would generate a magnetic field, and so on. So there's an oscillating electric field, and that can generate an oscillating magnetic field too. And the magnetic field in turn generates an oscillating electric field, so on. So they have an electromagnetic wave composed of these phantoms, they call them, and they travel at the speed of light. And then that generates the EM spectrum from radio waves and gamma waves. And anesthetics make consciousness evaporate, they found out through studies. So their site of action would be important in making something responsible for consciousness. And the biophotons, they can use these microtubules as conduits for consciousness. And the circulatory system is involved in the reception, transmission, and processing of electrodynamics and electromagnetic data. And it acts as what they call an animal magnetoreceptor. And like I said before, this can sense magnetic fields around you. So bioluminescence, that's a chemical reaction between ATP, the cell's energy that stores oxygen, and a molecule called luciferin, and it's spelled Luciferin. So luciferin then can convert chemical energy locked up in that ATP into into photons of light. So the biophotonic emissions, the detections, the absorption, the reflections, modifications, and creation of these, of the radiation, all come from these living organisms, and you can only get these through organic material. So the next have this thing called photomultipliers, photomultiplication. And this amplifies photons that are emitted into the ultraviolet spectrum and that are visible and that are near infrared ranges. So these photomultipliers are used in lots of fields like nuclear and particle physics, astronomy, medical imaging, and motion picture filmmaking or scanning. And that's called telesign, film scanning, telesign. But anyways, the photoelectric effect, where photons, they hit a metal surface and then the electrons are emitted. These photons, could they transmit thought? Yeah, I believe so. Could they transmit thought back to the nervous system? Yeah, I think that happens multiple times throughout the day. What they're calling it is a distress signal, though. And then they want to use this theory to see if biophotons can promote like wound healing or light tools used for the medical field, help cellular damage erase, or oxidative stress, electron leakage, increased concentration of superoxides, that would have the greater potential for electron swapping. And then that would increase photon production and quantum electromagnetic dynamics. So mathematically, they describe all this as a phenomenon that involves electrically charged particles that interact by exchanging these photons. Whether they interact with light or matter or between the charged particles, doesn't matter. But They call it the jewel of physics, and it's a good study. So they got to be extremely accurate, though, with their predictions of quantities. Like the anomalous magnetic moment of the electrons and what they call the Lamb shift of the energy levels of hydrogen. Because a resonant cavity is a cavity that has a standing wave, called standing wave platforms. And this can be built up in layers. And they call it a parallel piped resonant cavity. And this is used for electromagnetic waves. Okay, so after this would come how molecules, liquids, stargates happen, and symmetry laws, how that would come into play that affect existence of laboratory frame cross correlation functions. When you're talking about parity and time reversal. So the cross correlation functions are obtained systematically by repeated differentiation in the labs. And then you rotate frames of reference and imaging phenotypes and genomics with that. And then that would create something like a Rosen bridge, scanning tunneling microscope, quantum tunneling. I mean, the implications are just so far ranging. I mean, our cell phones alone are small quantum computers and use a form of quantum tunneling on a small scale level. Like they could put Sasquatch DNA into these computers. They could put alien DNA into these systems, into molecular computing. And then you could hybridize these computers by crossing different types of molecules and DNA from two different species. So you could advance the learning capabilities of the machine even by doing these things. So who knows how far it's taken off or what is actually in the mind and the brain of certain types of IA. So, man is trying to fix problems that God's already worked out before man was even placed here. And he's concerned, Hashem is concerned for humankind and where it's going in this technocracy. And humans are the capstone of creation. He's more concerned with humans than anything else here, more than animals, more than anything. Us as individuals and staying as human individuals so we can recognize who and what we are on a soul level. So CERN correlates to wormwood as well. And it's also been called the grid of Soka, S-O-C-A. And this is a girdle and a grid of souls that's connected to different systems in space that creates this soul catcher scanning technology. So Area 51 has like symbols like 5 stars plus 1. There's 155 DUMs now that connect to the bottomless pit. The ISS, what that's doing up there is it's collecting dark matter from wormwood. It's a siphoning system. And the angel that falls from heaven that's given the key to the bottomless pit, we will see in our lives. So back at Montauk, they were trying to open the pit, literally, from the water base. And Aquino, he had Abaddon energy to him. And he was taking directions from fallen angels. And the matriarch and patriarch of Scientology, Sea Org, that's also Abaddon and Leviathan energy too. And Aquino's ace is probably Belial, the sons of Belial. So to me, Nibiru's already gone and passed. But, Saturn's more likely wormwood in my eyes than anything, or something like that. So the Data they collected from Hawkinson's and Brookhaven Laboratories and the Plum Island experiments, all of that got shipped and sent somewhere else, repackaged, rebooted, upgraded, and it's just called something else. But Brookhaven Labs, that was tied more into Montauk because it outlined a lot of CERN's initial takeoff programs. And Iron Man just bought the windmill house located on Long Island that Marilyn Manson spent a lot of time at. There's two different ones, but they're both have a lot of MK Ultra affiliations with them. And a movie called Death Trap was made at one of them. And it was where the super soldiers were briefed at one time. And I also believe the real Hillary Clinton also lives out there. So a lot of people spent a lot of time in certain locations. And, you know, the governments converted most of the land above the weird like that. These are what they would call situations of time and space displacement. I guess that's a scientific term for that. So, you know, other people have seen me like in the same house, standing in front of a door looking at them when I'm actually in the kitchen. So I don't know if that's just astrally projecting or was it really bilocating? It's hard to determine. Or I'd appear like in a chair if somebody was thinking about me sometimes. I've just had a lot of supernatural things like that happen with a lot of people that I know.